to assess on the scope and the effects of the law. Now we're thinking here, if you're thinking external environment, PESTEL, then you're thinking the L within PESTEL, which is legislation. And this is focused on AQA A-level. So the three bits of law we need to look at is competition law, employment law, and environmental law. We'll start firstly with competition law. So competition law is about keeping business conduct in check. And there's key pieces of legislation that are in place for the UK, which is the Competition Act 1998 and the Enterprise Act 2002. It's also worth being aware, because of clearly with Brexit and the UK leaving the European Union, that this law is still aligned with EU law. Now, the three key bits of competition law is the repression of cartels, so try and avoid businesses colluding together, whether that's to manipulate prices or manipulate the restriction of output within that market. The key thing is to avoid collusion, and that's what the competition law aims to do. It also looks to ban abusive behaviour in a market by the market leaders, the dominant business within the market. Maybe to stop them doing predatory pricing, that's to undercut your rivals, to push your rivals out, or the reverse of that, price gouging, because maybe you are the monopoly, the sole distributor, the sole seller of a particular good, and you might set your prices very, very high. As a consequence, in an extreme version, that would be price gouging. So it's to ban that abusive behaviour. And the third thing is to supervise mergers, takeovers, also JVs, joint ventures, to ensure that they're not anti-competitive. And with 1, 2 and 3, it's enforced by the CMA in the UK. And that is the Competition and Markets Authority. Now, if we think about the impacts of competition law, well, number one, it allows for a level playing field amongst businesses. And that might be particularly helpful for smaller businesses, so they can help establish a position within the market, particularly when you're looking at banning certain practices. Also, it might have reputation issues, because if you fail to do these things, then you'll have reputational damage, and that could lead to lower sales and in worst case scenario for a business, fines if they don't abide by the rules and you're caught by the CMA. Now, the third thing is it might lead to changes in pricing strategies, particularly with predatory pricing and price gouging. And number 4, it might change your strategy in terms of whether you'll bother to pursue a merger or a takeover, because it might be that you believe that the CMA will block it from happening and therefore you won't bother to pursue it. Or it might be the reverse of that. But the key thing is you're thinking about it from a strategical point as a business. Now let's move on to the next one, which is employment law. So now let's look at employment law. So employment law is there to ensure labour markets, that's worker markets, are fair. Now, the first key piece of legislation is the Equal Pay Act 1970, which is effectively same pay for same work. Then follow Discrimination Acts, so Sex Discrimination, Race Relations Act, and Disability Discrimination Act 1995, which essentially is there to ensure there is not discrimination based on sex, race, or disability in terms of recruitment, in terms of training, in terms of promotion within that organisation. Then we have the Employment Relations Act, which is to ensure that if 50% of the workers within an organisation are members of a trade union, that employer must recognise that trade union is existence. And then the Employment Act 2008, which is to ensure that the minimum wage legislation is put in place, and also 0-hour contracts rights exist. And then that was extended in 2015 with the Small Business Enterprise and Employment Act to ensure there's more legislation in favour of minimum wages and also 0-hour contract protection, particularly because of those flexible organisations that are using more and more of 0-hour contracts. Now, if we think about the impacts of employment law, well, increased fines if you do not adhere to the regulation, of course, and that could impact employers' behaviour, hopefully for the better. And then number 2 is the cost of compliance to all of this legislation. You might have to put on a team in particular to ensure that the business, the organisation is meeting all of that, complying to all of that legislation. And then compliance might lead to a happier, a more motivated, a more productive workforce as a consequence of meeting all of these bits of legislation. Now let's move on to the last one, which is environmental law. So environmental law is focused on water and air quality, additionally wildlife, more recycling, less plastic waste, And the main law here and the most contemporary law is the Environment Act 2021, which looked at taking EU legislation that was in place, and because of the UK leaving the EU, it allowed to have the UK have some environmental acts in place, and that is the 2021 Environment Act. But there's a little bit of things that have been added onto that, which would be the ban of exporting of waste, binding targets on air and water quality, and the ban of importing of wood, of soy, of beef, of leather, of palm oil from illegally deforested land. And also there's been the introduction of the OEP, which is the Office of Environmental Protection, and their goal is to regulate this to ensure businesses are meeting the law, and if they do not meet the law, of course an impact would be a fine. Compliance may be therefore required to do these things, particularly if you're affected by, number one, the exporting of waste, or number two, the ban of importing. It will clearly affect you even more in that case, and that could lead to your business costs increasing. Additionally, compliance may improve reputation, or non-compliance will definitely damage reputation. And the final thing is, as I said there, non-compliance will lead to fines. So I hope that helps. I'll see you at the next sesh.